Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony J. Algman. Data is everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. Today, I'm joined by Michael Simon. Michael is the co-founder and CEO of Elucd, a data intelligence company that delivers real-time community opinion data to public and private sector leaders. Prior to founding Elucd, Michael advised organizations from global multinationals to public sector institutions to startups on data and analytics strategy. He established and managed the first of its kind in-house analytics department for Barack Obama's groundbreaking 2008 campaign for President of the United States, served in the Obama administration, and founded HaystaqDNA, a data science consultancy. And I tell you, I cut half of the bio before we read that, and it is incredibly exciting to have you on the show. Michael, welcome to the show. Please take a moment to give our audience a little bit more background on you and in your bio and how data plays a role in your career.
Yeah, Anthony, I come to data and analytics leadership a little bit sideways. I'm a lawyer by training. I had an undergraduate degree in political science and sort of gravitated towards maybe the quantitative side of that liberal art. Went to law school, and I had worked in presidential campaigns, which I found to be a really rewarding sort of startup-like environment, where a young person with like a lot of gumption and a little bit of skill could rise to have authority and responsibility very quickly, which was appealing to me in the 20s. And I had found the very first campaign that I worked on was John Kerry's campaign, and I found myself in the unit that was digesting all the polling data. I was the most junior person on this 3-person team, and people with a lot more experience and really big decisions to make were coming to me, a 1 year out of college kid, because I was sitting on all this data and I could help make them make big decisions, like where should we spend these millions of dollars on TV, or I want to put the candidate on a bus trip, Michigan and Ohio, where should we send them? And this sort of like lightning bolt struck me that this was a career defining moment, that being the person in possession of the data that could help guide a strategy was a way to play an outsized role in sort of early phase of my career. And honestly, that moment and that experience sort of set the path for essentially my entire career.
That's so cool. And it's gotta, feel rewarding too, to be involved in something that matters. And that's been something that I've had some public sector experience myself, not worked in the political space, but there has to be a thread to that as well that got you going with that too. It's got to feel good. So many of us data folks get kind of lost in the mix of things. Having that real data experience where you're pushing towards a bigger purpose, that's got to feel good too.
Absolutely, and I think that's always. I think there's people in politics who are motivated by love of the game, love of politics as a sport, and there's people in politics who are motivated by a cause. And I think I'm probably sit at the intersection of that Venn diagram. I do really enjoy, the game, but it's that purpose, that sense of purpose, that motivated me to take part in a field that is frankly chronically underpaid. And you continue to be chronically underpaid even in my adult life. So here we are.
Yeah, well, the economic structures of how those kinds of roles are a whole nother conversation that we'll have. But and it's interesting because you mentioned the game of politics. I think people are generally familiar broadly with what you mean by that. But I also think about like the game of data and how the folks that are listening to this podcast will have this. We all share the same kind of brokenness in terms of we think this is incredibly interesting. We think this is the most fascinating stuff. But if we bring it up to folks that don't, the conversation ends very quickly.
Well, it's interesting. There's been a really drastic change in the role of data in politics, and I've seen this mirrored in other sectors as well. But coming up through presidential campaigns and having worked on 2 back-to-back ones, Kerry and Obama, and then sort of seeing how it's evolved since then.
Yeah.
It started as a niche for nerds, like we were sitting in the corner, with our, I guess people kind of looked at this like with our protractors and trying to figure out what's going on. But when one of the reasons why the Obama campaign was a unique opportunity for me personally, and why it was, I think, renowned as being so data driven, is it was it think back to that era. Obama was an upstart. He was a challenger, challenging at that point a number of other candidates, including Hillary Clinton, who were the established candidates. All the talent, all the gurus, all the experts were elsewhere. And so we kind of had this laboratory where people like me, who were young and had a point of view to do things differently, could do what we were going to do without running up into a lot of big egos and a lot of gurus who, this is the way we've been doing things for 2 decades.
Right.
And it was an incredibly refreshing experience. And we were doing things that people now are the norm, but at that time were radical, like deciding where we should put offices by the number of persuadable voters and the density of persuadable voters on a map. Like literally, we plot zones on a map that you should put an office here, here, and here. The way that decision used to be made was whose uncle had an office space that they could rent you for the least, so the backdrop created the opportunity for data to be at the core of the strategy as opposed to being sort of on the periphery.
Well, that's fascinating, because you think about back to 2008, that you really were at this kind of transition point where the ability to access incredibly powerful data tools was coming online right at that time as well. And so now all of it, you're able to do more with data. You didn't need to go spend $100,000 on a server just to be able to crunch the numbers. You were able to do that on a laptop at that point, and then be able to start acting on it. And I think as we've seen progressive elections since then, you see that more and more people have gotten into the mix of being able to do data analytics and processing data and trying to come up with good approaches, to the point where we find ourselves now where we are swimming in data every direction we go in.
Yes.
And it's, there's a lot I want to talk to you about this. And so let's start simple. We've been talking about elections. Let's start simple on some of these topics. So, in an election year, and this has been true as long as I can remember, you can't escape the countless polls and the countless, quotes of, who's trending well here, and how are things changing, and what are the demographics and all of that. We hear these poll numbers constantly from different sources and all this. How do campaigns actually take poll informations, or how the public feels about issues, or what have you, and how does that translate into figuring out what to do? Like, it's one thing to hear about a poll. Does a good poll mean we're going to go invest less money in that area, or does it? How does that all shake out?
Yeah, great question. And I think the thing I would start by saying is that in every campaign, pays attention to the public polling, the stuff that you and I see, that we see Nate Silver crunching on 538, stuff that gets reported in the news, whatever. All that public polling might be done by the Washington Post, might be done by Siena College, whoever it is sort of ambient noise to campaigns. Every campaign has hired if not, I think the Obama campaign had 5 or 6 pollsters on retainer doing polls in different states continuously. There were new polls, especially when you get this close to election, new polls almost every day in some states. And you're kind of like paying attention. The public polls are noise, but the signal that you're using to make strategic decisions comes from your pollsters, from people that you are paying. And so you are making big decisions based on that polling. If you think about what any organization worth their salt is, setting KPIs, or setting measurable goals that they track against, and it might be in a business, monthly recurring revenue, or it might be the net promoter score of my customers, or it might be number of new, whatever the things are you're measuring.
Right.
That all that a campaign cares about, really. There's other proxies we have for this, like how many donations am I getting, yada, yada, yada. But the number one thing that matters is, am I going to get to 50% plus 1 vote on election? Period, full stop. If you get to 49.99999%, you lose. And so the reason every campaign invests so much in polling and in the data infrastructure that tells us what the population is thinking is, it's really the only way of understanding is what we are doing working, and are we or are we not on a path to win. So the Biden campaign or the Trump campaign are sitting right now looking at a map of the country, looking at the electoral votes for every single state, and they're saying, okay, we've got we're recording this in late September, so 40 odd days until election day. Which of these states are basically inside the strike zone and which are not, and where can I invest the resources that I've got these resources. I can plot them on this map. Those resources are going to be dollars spent on TV in a normal non-pandemic year. It's offices and field organizers knocking on doors, all that sort of direct voter contact stuff. Then there's phone calls, volunteers, digital ads, all this stuff. They got all these resources. Where do I send the candidate? Where do I fly and land Air Force One to have a candidate do all that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
You're plotting all that on a board, and you're saying, all right, well, I need to get 270 electoral votes to win. I feel confident in these 240. I got to get 30 more. How am I going to allocate these pieces to make sure I don't lose any of the 240 that I'm confident? I have to keep that where it is, but I've also got to invest, and I can't just get those 30. I probably got to invest in 50 electoral votes just to be safe. So it's campaigns are doing very complicated, complex math on what is the cost per vote and the cost per electoral vote, which ultimately has how the electoral college has decided. In every one of these places, they're saying, all right, well, the cost, and we ran, and there's, everyone runs these models. Like, right, the cost of an extra, 1,000 impressions of digital advertising in the Tampa area in Florida is likely to yield us this many votes. It costs this much money. So, where do I allocate each incremental dollar? And that's stuff that was totally novel a dozen years ago. And now it is table stakes. It's table stakes for any campaign sitting there, they're doing that math.
Yeah, well, and hearing you talk about this, it's making me think about things that I've never really thought about in these terms before. Because I think, obviously, an election cycle and a campaign, there's a clear parallel. You were talking about with Net Promoter Scores, a clear parallel to marketing, right? Great. Yeah. But there's some really weird, unique stuff happening as well, because you have there's a much more direct sales process. So it's like you're working up to the big proposal. Are you going to get the deal or you're not going to get the deal? And then you also think about, this is all extremely ephemeral. Like, you are going to be doing this and doing this and doing this until election, and then you are so done. Like, no matter what happens, this is completely over. And I imagine that causes a lot of strange byproducts. Like, because it's not like we're hiring for a business that's going to be around for the next 30 years of my career. We're hiring a business that's going to be around for the next 6 weeks, 6 months, whatever that time frame looks like. And I imagine, like, everybody loves to focus on presidential politics, but I imagine that these things percolate out to other national races, Senate races, local races, even to some extent. I imagine that my local mayor of a 50,000 person suburb probably isn't doing anything tremendously advanced, but I bet he's looking at some sort of data and thinking about some way of allocating his very limited resources to try to get reelected in our little neighborhood. So, can you talk about, like, because you have a lot of experience outside of just political campaigns, and you've worked in the White House, you've worked with government, you've worked in the public and private sector roles. Can you talk a little bit about this notion of election, when we're in an election season, everybody's thinking about this a lot. How does that parallel to some of these other things? And I know I'm kind of just all over the place, but what do you see in those parallels?
It is interesting. I mean, I always described it as the dynamic as such. Imagine Coke and Pepsi, competed for a year and a half for who was going to go buy a 2-liter bottle, which one, and everyone was going to buy it in the same day, and whoever sold one less bottle went out of business.
Yeah,
that's basically they both go out of business, I guess, but one wins, and then they both go out of business. Like, that's kind of what happens here. Is these campaigns get built. And there are a lot of direct relationships to the political world is an enormous ecosystem on its own, as you indicated. I mean, there's tens of thousands of races that will be decided, not just the presidential this fall. And there's elections happening almost every quarter in the U.S. for some state or local office somewhere. So it's a huge system. But I think having gone from campaigns and now working I spent quite a bit of time consulting in the private sector, and then now working starting a startup that serves cities, mostly municipalities, city managers, mayors, police chiefs, et cetera, are customers. I've seen a lot of similarities, and I think one of them is you mentioned this sort of crossover, the sort of relationship between the the customer and measuring and tracking kind of what the customer thinks. I think that's one of the key observations that I've had. It's been really interesting to see how the political, government, and private sector approach this problem, because everyone fundamentally has the same challenge, which is I need to attract people to my cause, buying my product, consuming my media, whatever the case is, and understanding what people want and following the lead what people want, and using data, not just gut instinct, to inform that and to track our progress, I think is something that has totally revolutionized these three different sectors at different times in different ways. So like we just talked about politics, the advent of net promoter score in the private sector has had innumerable and vast impact in the way that giant corporations behave. I always think about airlines. Think about how bad the experience was of flying an airline, 20 years ago. I mean, I think about growing up. I grew up in Detroit, and they would talk about Northwest Airlines. Like it seemed like the airline, they could not care less about the experience of the passenger. But then now, every time you fly, and I guess in these maybe we'll return to normal flying in a year, who knows? But every time you fly, you get a survey after that asks you, how was your experience? How was the gauge? How was the flight attendant? How was the food? Was it, all that data flows back into the central nervous system of that organization. And whether you're the CEO or whether you're the baggage handler on the plane, you have this constant feedback loop of how good of a job you're doing serving your customer. And we know, because we collect this data and we can relate it to other data, we know that net promoter score is directly related to the lifetime customer value.
Sure.
And so like the advent, there's a lot of things that came together here. Some of them are data related. Some of them are culture related to these organizations, but it's totally changed the way these organizations behave. And they know they can look at you because of the data they are collecting, the database, and they can look at every single one of their customers, and they can tell you down to a cent what they estimate the value is that you will spend on their product for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And they know that keeping you happy because you fly on a certain pattern is 13 times more important than keeping me happy, and they will spend the money and the resources to make sure that happens.
And I love the airline example, because everybody loves to throw the airlines under the bus immediately to say, oh, it's gotten so horrible. There are aspects certainly that have evolved, but we like to focus on certain attributes. Oh, the seats are getting more crammed in or whatever. But do you also realize you can fly cross country for like $200 in today's money? That's
pretty incredible.
So the airlines have responded to their inputs and the data that tells them, hey, people want to travel more. And this is all pre-pandemic, patterns, but yes, they want to travel more, and they don't want to pay much, and they're happy to travel more if they can pay less. And that's the number one driver. And that. And I love, don't get me wrong, I love to be one of the people throwing the airlines under the bus. I think they are awful a lot of the time, but I think you make a very strong point, and I thought that in fairness, I should at least highlight that as well.
Yes.
And so let's stay in the kind of broad, not just political spectrum for a moment, because even though like right now, obviously, we're recording, and the pandemic is still, going on. COVID-19. We're working remotely. We're interviewing remotely. A lot of our work is not in person as it used to be. And everybody's constantly thinking, like, doom scrolling is now a term. Like, that's going to be in a dictionary pretty soon, And so but everybody seemingly has become an armchair data scientist, and they don't necessarily have training to be some. But as we mentioned earlier, we're swimming in data. There's numbers being thrown around everywhere, and it got me thinking. It's like, is this a good thing? Like, is this getting us to where we need to be, or is it, with the lack of this understanding of how data analytics really should be, are we getting much worse? Are we making it so that being data driven is actually becoming harder because we're just overwhelmed by data and things we don't really understand as individuals? Or is this a necessary step? Like the awareness piece, which I think we could agree has increased, the importance of data has increased, but being able to do something about that hasn't necessarily happened as well as I think we would like. There's as much misuse as use, I guess, is my hypothesis. Can you react to that? What do you think about that?
There's two things that jump out to me with respect to this period that we're in that I think have, I think are the general lessons that I've seen in the world with respect to data, but seem to be playing out in a very challenging way right now. And those are, one, you manage what you measure, and having whatever you want to call them, key performance indicators, dashboard measure, whatever they are, that are agreed upon, that we all agree that tracking this as success are really, and having universal understanding and shared understanding of that's really vital. And the second is understanding probability is a real challenge for almost every person, including those who practice in the field of statistics and probability. And we're seeing those two factors sort of rear their ugly head right now. I think back to the beginning of this pandemic, which I think for many Americans at least was March 11th. To me, that the day that the president addressed the nation from the Oval Office, NBA canceled the rest of the season. Tom Hanks announced he had COVID, and no one knew anybody at that point had COVID. Like, to me, that was the moment to speak. Think back to that period, and now you fast forward, several months. We're reporting this, 6 odd months past that, where we're all, as you said, we're all armchair data scientists. We're all fluent in our, the R0 values and the number of cases and the number of infections, whatever. I think the challenge is there is not, because there's been leadership tugging in different directions from even within just government alone, from the federal government to state governments to cities, and not an agreement on this is the one number that we should all be focused on. And when this number is above this level, we should behave this way. When it's below this level, we should behave this way. And most people who are paying a lot of attention are really confused on what matters. What are we working towards? Why am I no one loves wearing a mask. Why am I wearing a mask? It sucks. There's no clear goal. And I think that's, you're seeing that play out in a really disjointed response, and a disjointed reaction from the American people who largely, want to do good, you see moments of crisis, the immediate aftermath of the beginning era of this pandemic, right after 9/11, where Americans band together and all rowed the boat in one direction. And then you look at where we are now. So I think it's this is an area where data leadership actually really matters, and not having it leads us to this sort of chaotic situation.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point around the notion of all this complexity, all this chaos in the numbers, with a lack of clarity and alignment on what is most important in those numbers. We're left to all figure it out. And that's why it is this kind of swirling of conclusions and actions, and when do I do this, when do I not? And everybody's, maybe we can even assume everybody's good intentions trying to solve it. And that may be a stretch, but even if it was good intentions, you still come up with a whole bunch of different conclusions. And so I don't know that we'll be able to solve the data problem for COVID right now, but I think there's an important lesson here that I want to highlight to anybody who's listening to this, is that we're probably also thinking about data in our businesses. And in our businesses, we do have an opportunity to say, this number is the one that's most important. This is the thing we want to track to. And so when you start thinking about how do you want to run a business with data, how do you identify key performance indicators and say, here's what we do. Can we get, is your company 100 people or 100,000 people or 1 million people? How do you align the entirety of the organization around something that can be relevant through the entire organization? And I think your example with the airlines, it may not always be exactly the same number, but you should be able to look at any numbers in individual departments. Or if you're a baggage handler for an airline, or you're a pilot for an airline, or you're the CEO for an airline, you may be looking at different numbers, but they should all kind of roll up to the same story. They should all have that kind of tie-in and that clarity of action to say, if that baggage handler is data-driven and they are looking at numbers that are relevant to them and their specific function, how does that support the numbers that the CEO is looking at? And so that person is relevant in their function, and do those all align? And so as data leaders in our organizations, how do we create that kind of consistency throughout, in clarity at each point as well, and then clarity as the whole?
Strongly agree. And I think that it all has to tie back to simplicity and unitary focus and mission that data supports as opposed to around.
That's great. That's great. And I mean, this is not what I thought we would cover in the conversation before, but it's fascinating to see how these things kind of come up and something as what I think a lot of us think of as wholly separate is this whole world of politics from what we do at work all day long. We realize, oh, well, functionally, there's a lot of commonalities in this.
Absolutely.
So, and you've obviously done a lot in market research and a lot in variety of contexts. We've talked a little bit about some of the trends that we've seen, but let's go in more detail into like what has changed in the last 5 or 10 years in terms of, things that people may not have necessarily noticed, but have actually evolved substantially, and that might impact us either as individuals or in our organizations.
Yeah. And market research as a field, has changed drastically over the last decade, and market research in any sector, politics, private sector, which obviously is a huge overgeneralization of a very, very diverse sector,
Sure.
Government especially. And I think a couple of trends. One is that the way in which we conducted research has changed drastically just based on like our human behavior. So the fact that market research, even a decade ago, even thinking back to the Obama campaign 12 years ago, almost every single piece of polling that we did involved a pollster calling a voter at their home landline telephone during dinner. And you would maybe add in a little bit of a mobile phone sample to try to get that. And most research today, when you see, I would urge all your listeners, when you see whether it's a political poll about this upcoming election, whether it's a piece of market research about your industry, whether it's research done, by your company or by your educational institution, just to scroll all the way to the bottom and look at the methods section. Because one of the ways in which things has changed is we all know, like, it does not take being a research practitioner to know that anything that involves calling people on a landline telephone probably is not going to pick up the opinion of your average person. So methods have changed. And in fact, Pew, which is, I consider the gold standard of public opinion research, has now shifted almost all of their survey research away from telephone research into digital research done online. My company, Elucd, we effectively do market research for local governments. 100% of our research is done digitally. Why? Because that's where people's eyeballs are. The reason we called people on the phone before is because that was how you reached most people. When most people move to having their devices in their hands every moment of their day, that's now the right way to reach people. Upwards of 90% of American adults now have a smartphone, and the average American checks their phone more than 60 times a day. And that was prior to this pandemic. So if you want to reach people, go to where their eyeballs already are. I think that's like one big lesson, one big change.
That's great to know, because I was wondering, because I am one of those people who I don't even remember which decade I got rid of the landline phone. So that's been long gone. But even my mobile phone in the last few years, I've just basically stopped answering it. I don't answer my phone unless the number's already programmed in my phone. So if you're a contact and I know who you are, you've got maybe a 50-50 chance that I'll actually answer, because a lot of times I still don't answer the phone because I'm in another meeting or I'm doing something else or I have family time or whatever. And it's difficult to reach people on the phone anyway. So I very rarely call people without texting first or what have you. And I find too, and it'll be interesting to see how this evolves completely, but I found to myself, like when you would normally like even schedule a call with somebody, I'm starting to find a preference for video conferencing services that allow us to call in independently so that we don't have to, try to reach that person and that person's still running back to wherever they need to be or what have you. And I think there's going to be more of that kind of asynchronous connection to establish verbal communications or video communications, going forward, because it allows you to deconnect from your specific device. Like I hate taking calls on my phone. I love taking calls on my computer where I can have my headset and I can have my hands free and all of that. The more we can continue to push towards those kinds of device relationships and be responsive to that, I'm glad to hear that the polling and market research has adapted to that long before I thought of it myself. So
any business of any kind, and any government, frankly, government services of any kind, has to adapt to the way that consumers behave and want to engage with the world. I think we all have choices now, many choices in how we receive information. And that ripple effect is playing out through every single, whether you're a government trying to get people a driver's license, or whether you're a business trying to get people to consume your content, or you're a market researcher trying to get someone to take your survey. You have to meet people where they are and where they want to be and how they want to be reached.
Well, and I think about like the media consumption side too. Even like television is going through an enormous overhaul right now, where people want to start to get some separation between those devices. And some of the weird things that have happened, I still laugh that you can't get ESPN by subscribing to ESPN Plus.
Right.
Like that's, you get other stuff, but not the one thing that you actually want. And so like we're in this shakeout period clearly, but I think it leads to potentially some business opportunities for folks that are out there because of some of those frictions that remain from previous paradigms in how people consume content. But I think also it's going to get us to a place where things are more loosely coupled, and you're able to choose your content consumption device or mechanism separately from the content itself. And I think we're making progress to that, but it is a enormous overall. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, 2008, you're doing data analytics for an election. Also happens to be the year the iPhone first came out. And it's like, can you even imagine that time anymore? It's so, I don't even know what that was like anymore.
When I didn't have a 12 megapixel camera in my pocket at all times, it was connected to the internet. Yeah. Wow.
Exactly. So, I want to think about too. So we've talked a lot about, we've talked about election stuff. We've talked about market research. Let's talk a little bit more about, the individual actor in small businesses and thinking about, a lot of these things, you still data, compiling data, doing analytics, it still takes a certain amount of effort, research skills, tooling, all of those things are prohibiting to the individual to some extent. Even though we're inundated with data, it's hard for us to make it actionable, especially as individuals or in small businesses. Do you have recommendations or things to think about? Like if you're in one of these grassroots campaigns, in one of the smaller campaigns that doesn't have any funding and needs to do something, or in a small business, you're running a restaurant in a pandemic and you're trying to figure out how do I, start to figure out what to order instead, or where to invest the meager dollars we have between carry out business, patio dining, like those kinds of things. Is there an easy way to start to become more data driven that doesn't require an enormous amount of knowledge or investment?
Yeah, I think, and I see this happen time and again in business of all sizes, small and large. I think it starts with both top down and bottom up. And by top down, I mean you could conceivably go, and I mean, people approach this and they think, oh boy, this is a really complicated problem. There's so many different directions I could go in. Well, start from the top. What is my objective? If you are a restaurant, is it, increase visits of, repeat visits of your existing customers? Is it attract new customers? What is it you're trying to do? If it's a campaign, are you trying to, attract new voters to your cause, or trying to get the voters you already have to make sure they vote in election? What is the specific goal you're trying to do? And then what is the one KPI that everyone in this organization, that if you stop them, you're like, hey, what's the one thing we're measuring? They'd be able to repeat back to you what it is and where that stands today. That is ultimately real data leadership, because you're putting data in, literally you're leading with data, saying that this is the thing we all agree matters, and everyone in this organization speaks the same language and so on. So I think that's sort of the top down. Just pick and start with one. Just start with the one thing that we are trying to do. That will often tell you downstream what is the data that should be collected. But I think it's also vital that everyone in an organization, whether it's a 5-person organization or a 5,000-person organization, understand that data about, especially data about a customer or data about a transaction, has real monetary value. And the failure to capture that value is leaving money on the table. So if thinking in a political context, if you are having a political gathering, and you have the candidates show up, and you're going to have 100 people in a room to listen to them speak, what is the value of capturing the name, email address, and phone number and maybe even the likelihood of their support for your candidate of every single person in that room. Is it 50 cents per? Is it $1 per? Is it two? Because that helps you think like, this is $1,000 opportunity for me. So I should be investing in, what, like, I know that if I have 100 people, I can get 10 of them to donate money, yada, yada. Same thing goes with any small business or restaurants. Put it in terms of dollars and cents, because that helps make clear to everyone involved in making sure that happens, that there is money left on the table if you don't do it.
That's Michael, I want to emphasize something that you just said too. Is you're estimating. You're not going to have an answer necessarily to the penny of this is the value of this thing. And we shouldn't expect that that's going to be true in our small businesses or big businesses. It's an estimate, but it's a valuable estimate. And it's something that can be thought through and debated. You can swap in different variables. I often coach organizations, get the algorithm right. Understand if you knew this number, how would you go about doing it? And then separately, you can debate what you think that number should be, or what value should we use here, or which one should we try. But I find that if you try to do them both at the same time, like create the equation and set the variables at the same time, bad things happen.
Yes, that is completely correct, and I think it distracts from how much better you can make things by just having a theory of the world, and then saying, well, what if this assumption was 25% too high? What if it's 25% too low? It allows you sort of within a model to make that change. And I just think about the simple, if you mentioned restaurant, I mean, restaurants are really struggling right now in this COVID-19 era. If someone shows up at a restaurant with a friend and is willing to dine in a restaurant right now outdoors, that person is of great value to you as a restaurant right now. This is someone who feels comfortable in this situation dining in a restaurant. They're willing to spend money at your place of business. How much money they've spent. They've brought a guest. So, your guess is as good as mine as what is the likelihood of getting that person to come back to your restaurant. But you probably have a pretty good shot if you capture their name and their email address, whatever, what their order was, et cetera, of getting them to come back. And if you don't, it's money on the table.
Yeah. And I don't know why this just triggered a thought in my head, because I was thinking about, like, in that circumstance, a restaurant probably isn't going to know some of the details about who that diner is. They may not even get their name, maybe, and the overlay of what they could capture, like if they had, if somebody paid with a credit card, it's probably not ethical to like take their name from the credit card and start creating customer record there. I don't think that's legal, but I'm not entirely sure. But it got me thinking, going down that path, when I think about, the election campaigns, and people are donating and there's information being shared. And what I don't see a lot of the time, because things are moving too fast and everything's so crazy and you're getting inundated from every direction, I don't recall, signing anything or agreeing to anything that said, take all my information forever. Like, how does privacy work in that world? Because it is not something I've ever really thought about before.
It's incredibly complex, and it also interfaces with something you brought up earlier in the conversation, where these campaigns basically go out of business every November. And so the way this used to work was, campaigns would basically, start from zero, build a house, and then burn the house down on November 3rd. And everything, including the data, would go away. You now see a lot of between campaign infrastructure that's evolving, largely in a partisan context. So the Republican Party has their own, Democratic Party has their own. You see some upstart play. It's created a space for players like ActBlue on the left, which is a payment processor pop up. And you see a lot of the parties stand in place to try to create CRM that last in between campaigns, so that when someone becomes a candidate, they come in the door with a bunch of data. But it does create a lot of new challenges around privacy, because frankly, we didn't used to have to really think about, because it all got thrown out in the trash.
Yeah, well, and I imagine that, I mean, that has implications broadly towards, this two-party system that we find ourselves in. Like, barriers to entry into the political context become a big deal in ways they hadn't been before, because of the need to create these that last much longer than an individual campaign. So that's
unless you're Mike Bloomberg, it's almost impossible to stand up an independent or meaningful independent campaign on a national level today. And data is a huge moat for that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and that's what we were seeing, right? When candidates enter right now, they tend to do it with really big pockets, and
Yeah.
that's expanded from that's always been the case. And people that are wealthy go into politics more than those that are not. But it seems to have expanded, and this seems like a good reason why that would be the case. So
Data is a great moat in business, and it's a great moat in politics.
yeah, I can see that. Um, I want to give you a chance. We only have a couple minutes left, and I'd like to learn a little bit more about Elucd and how you've taken some of this experience in the past. We touched on it a little bit in what you guys do, but can you talk a little bit more about your mission today and what you're working on and how all of this career that you've had so far has led you to what you're doing now? I just want to make sure that the listeners have that sense of that story of this is how it goes from getting a start and the kinds of things that you did.
Yeah, Elucid was started about 4 years ago, largely pulling the thread. I mean, look, we talked a lot about Net Promoter Score and the KPIs around customer satisfaction in the private sector. There's nothing like that exists in the public sector.
Yeah.
Most people feel not listened to by their government, and there really isn't an effective way outside of your traditional your city council meeting or your community listening session, whatever the case may be, to have your voice heard. Or there's an election every 4 years where, again, you either rehire or fire everyone in charge. In between those times, elected officials, leaders of city departments, et cetera, they don't really have a feedback loop on how good of a job they're doing. And so the idea was, what if there was something like Net Promoter Score for the public sector?
Right.
We started doing this in policing. And of course, we've had over the course of the summer of 2020, a number of national sort of flashpoint incidents. We're in the middle of one right now around dissatisfaction with policing or challenges with policing throughout the country in a number of American cities. And it's incredibly hard. Policing was a place we started both because it was so fraught with this challenge, but also it's a place where the entire model of policing relies on trust and relationship between police and the community they serve. So if you think about it, even the 911 system requires you to believe that when I see something happen that is bad in my community, I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to call these people on the other end of the phone. I'm going to ask them to come and show up. And I believe when they show up that things will get better. That's a core underlying assumption, that relationship of trust, that I can call the police, they will show up and things will get better. And that act is voluntary. I'm not required to call the police. And then, of course, I'm willing to be a witness in the investigation, all the stuff that happens. There is a underlying relationship there, the quality of which is not just nice to have, it's a must have for the functioning of this core institution of our country. And so we started in policing because there was a real opportunity to make things better and provide data where none exists. Policing is not an area where we had to convince anybody being data-driven matters. Yeah. There's been a revolution in policing over the last 2 decades, largely for the positive, in using data to drive policing decisions. Like things that we would now consider to be very elementary, like we should take all the crime that happens in the city and start measuring it. Is it going up? Is it going down? Where? In what neighborhoods? What time of year? And using that to allocate resources. That was like a radical idea 20 years ago when it began in New York City, where I live, with CompStat. It's now the norm everywhere. There's 18,000 police departments in America, and most of them use some form of very elementary data analysis to understand how to allocate resources. So we thought if we could plug new data into that system, on something they don't currently have any kind of measurable anything outside of, how does it feel today, that we can potentially transform the way that police behave. And so we built this company, Elucd, to do exactly that, to provide measures of effectively consumer satisfaction in a world where everyone who lives in a city is a consumer, potential consumer of a city service. And we provide this now to city governments from some big cities like Chicago and Seattle, Washington, D.C., down to smaller communities. I think our smallest customer is El Segundo, California, a city of 20,000 people.
Wow. Well, I think, I mean, and just hearing you talk about that, we have a sense, and we like to talk about in the data space, we're kind of the lifeblood of business, and we are kind of the finger on the pulse of what's happening. I think you've articulated that extremely well, in that this is really possible in the case, and data helps us do our jobs better, whether in the private sector or in the public sector and politics, and you name it. There's opportunities that data gives us that we're just not going to get anywhere else, and seeing how that same general type of analysis information plays in all of these different spaces, I think is fascinating, and very apropos, and certainly very timely, given where we are in the world right now, and the timing of this recording. So Michael, I think that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for being on the show. This has been incredibly fun for me, and I'm sure extremely informative for our listeners.
That's great. It's been a total pleasure for having me, Anthony.
Thank you. And thank you for watching or listening today. You'll find links and more information about today's topic in the show notes. Subscribe to our show on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Visit Algman.com to learn more about Algman data leadership and the many ways we can help you become a data leader. Stay safe during these unusual times, and go make an impact.